Human intelligence did not appear because the world was gentle. It appeared because everything around early humans was trying to erase them. For millions of years, humans were not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most protected. They had no claws, no fur, no poison, no natural weapons worth trusting. What they developed instead was something far more dangerous to themselves. A mind that could imagine threats that were not present. A mind that could remember pain long after the wound healed. A mind that could plan for futures that might never arrive. This intelligence helped humans survive predators, hunger, cold, and extinction. But it also introduced fear before danger, grief before loss, and exhaustion without physical effort. No other species pays this price so consistently. No other species carries its survival tool inside the same organ that keeps it awake at night. If intelligence was evolution's solution to human weakness, why does it so often feel like the source of our deepest unrest? Human intelligence did not emerge in a world that favored humans. It emerged in a world that quietly rejected them. Early humans entered landscapes already dominated by faster animals, stronger bodies, sharper teeth, thicker hides, and instincts refined over millions of years. Compared to most mammals of similar size, the human body was fragile. Skin tore easily, muscles tired quickly, bones broke without dramatic force. There was no natural armor, no claws to grip prey, no fangs to end a fight quickly. In open terrain, humans could not outrun predators. In forests, they could not climb as efficiently as those who lived there. In the cold, they lacked fur. In the heat, they lacked speed. Survival did not come from physical superiority, because there was none to rely on. This weakness was not temporary, it was structural. Generation after generation, the human body remained exposed, slow to mature, slow to heal, and dependent on cooperation. In such conditions, instinct alone was not enough. Instinct works best when the environment is stable and predictable. But early human environments were neither. Climate shifted, food sources disappeared, predators changed patterns. A body built on fixed responses would fail too often. What began to matter more than strength was flexibility. The ability to adjust behavior without waiting for biological change became the only viable path forward. This is where intelligence quietly began to replace muscle, not as a triumph, but as a necessity. Intelligence allowed early humans to survive encounters they could not physically win. It allowed them to anticipate danger instead of meeting it head-on. It allowed them to observe patterns, remember locations, and modify behavior across seasons. These were not abstract skills. They were survival tools shaped by constant exposure to risk. A weak body forced the mind to compensate. Each decision carried weight because mistakes were costly. A wrong choice meant injury or death. Over time, selection favored those who could pause before acting, those who could consider alternatives, those who could imagine outcomes without testing them physically. Intelligence became a buffer between the human body and the hostile world it moved through. This buffering role explains why human intelligence is deeply tied to anxiety and vigilance. When the body cannot defend itself well, the mind stays alert longer. Awareness expands. Threat detection becomes continuous rather than situational. The brain learns to simulate danger before it arrives, because waiting until danger is visible is often too late. This mental rehearsal was not designed for comfort. It was designed for survival in a body that could not absorb much damage. Intelligence, in this sense, is not an upgrade layered onto strength. It is a replacement for what never fully developed. The human mind carries responsibilities that the human body could not fulfill. This imbalance did not disappear as intelligence grew. It intensified. As tools improved and social structures formed, the body remained largely the same. It still required protection. It still healed slowly. It still aged poorly. Intelligence continued to expand, not because the body became safer, but because it remained vulnerable. Every gain in cognitive ability reduced immediate physical risk while increasing long-term mental load. The mind learned to do what the body could not, but it never forgot why it had to. From standing too upright in a world not built for it, from lacking the physical answers that other species already possessed, intelligence became the answer because there were no others left. Bodies evolve toward a specific solution, then refine it. Speed becomes faster, armor becomes thicker, weapons become sharper. Once a direction is chosen, instinct locks it in place. Humans never fully entered any of these paths. They did not become the fastest runners on open ground. They did not grow the strength to overpower prey. They did not develop natural weapons that could reliably defend them. Even endurance, often cited as a human advantage, only mattered when paired with planning, cooperation, and foresight. On its own, endurance would not have been enough. This failure to specialize physically was not an accident. It was the result of constraint. The human body sits in an uncomfortable middle ground, too upright to be stable in rapid combat, too lightly built to absorb injury, too slow to escape quickly. Each potential physical upgrade carried trade-offs that humans could not afford. Greater muscle mass would have increased caloric needs beyond what early environments could sustain. Thicker bones would have reduced flexibility and speed. Larger teeth or claws would have interfered with tool use. Evolution did not ignore these options. It tested them. They simply did not work well enough. In a changing environment, committing to one physical solution became dangerous. Predators adapted. Landscapes shifted. Food sources moved. A body optimized for one condition failed under another. What humans lacked in physical specialization, they compensated for with behavioral range. Instead of claws, they shaped stone. Instead of fangs, they sharpened edges. Instead of thicker skin, they built shelter. Each of these choices required foresight rather than reflex. They required the ability to imagine outcomes before acting. This is a critical shift. Instinct reacts after a stimulus appears. Intelligence acts before the stimulus arrives. For a physically weak species, reacting late often meant dying early. The inability to rely on brute force forced early humans to extend survival into the mental realm. Decisions had to be made without direct physical feedback. Risk had to be evaluated abstractly. Failure could not always be tested safely. This is why intelligence favored caution, planning, and delayed action. These traits look like wisdom in hindsight, but they originated from necessity. When strength fails, avoidance becomes strategy. When speed fails, prediction becomes defense. When weapons fail, cooperation becomes protection. None of these behaviors emerge automatically. They must be learned, refined, and transmitted. That process required a brain capable of holding multiple possibilities at once, a brain that could suppress immediate impulses in favor of imagined futures. Physical evolution could not deliver this flexibility fast enough. Cognitive evolution could. This is why human intelligence is not clean or elegant. It is layered, compensatory, and often inefficient. It carries redundant systems, overlapping fears, and persistent alertness. These are not design flaws. They are traces of failed physical options. Each abandoned evolutionary path left pressure behind. That pressure accumulated in the mind. Intelligence absorbed it. Humans did not choose thinking over strength because thinking was better. They chose it because strength was unavailable. Intelligence became the only space where adaptation could continue without reshaping the body. Over time, this made cognition the primary survival surface. But it also meant that survival stress moved inward. The body stopped evolving toward dominance. The mind evolved toward vigilance. This trade-off defines human intelligence. It explains why thinking often feels heavy, restless, and unending. The mind is carrying responsibilities that other species distribute across muscle, instinct, and anatomy. Human intelligence exists not as proof of superiority, but as evidence of paths evolution could not take. By the time intelligence became central to human survival, it was no longer an advantage layered on top of other traits. It was the trait holding everything else together. Strength had failed to scale. Speed had failed to protect. Instinct had failed to adapt quickly enough. What remained was the ability to think before acting, to coordinate instead of confront, to shape the environment rather than compete within it. Intelligence became the final strategy, not because it was powerful, but because it was flexible. It allowed humans to survive without committing their bodies to a single solution. A tool could be changed, a shelter could be moved, a plan could be revised. The body, however, could not be replaced. This made the mind the safest place for experimentation. Early humans learned to test ideas instead of actions. They rehearsed outcomes internally rather than risking injury externally. This shift reduced immediate physical danger, but increased cognitive load. Survival moved from muscle to memory, from reflex to anticipation, from reaction to imagination. Intelligence allowed humans to live slightly ahead of the present moment. That distance was enough to avoid many threats. It was also enough to introduce constant mental engagement. The mind had to stay active even when the body was still. This pattern reinforced itself across generations. Those who thought ahead survived more often. Those who coordinated effectively left more descendants. Over time, intelligence became the primary filter through which survival passed. But it never replaced vulnerability. It managed it. The human body remained exposed, dependent, and slow to recover. Intelligence worked around these limits, building layers of protection that existed outside the body. Clothing replaced fur, weapons replaced teeth, social bonds replaced individual defense. Each layer added safety while deepening reliance on cognition. The more humans depended on intelligence, the less margin they had for instinctive error. Mistakes became costlier. A misjudged plan could affect an entire group. A false assumption could lead to starvation. Intelligence therefore evolved with caution built in. Doubt, hesitation, and overthinking were not side effects. When physical error means death, mental simulation becomes necessary. This explains why human intelligence is often paired with worry rather than confidence. The mind remains active because the body cannot afford complacency. Intelligence also allowed humans to survive environments they could not biologically adapt to. Instead of waiting for evolutionary change, they altered their surroundings. This reversed the typical relationship between organism and habitat. Most species fit themselves into the world. Humans made the world fit them. This power came at a cost. The mind became responsible not just for survival, but for maintenance. It had to monitor tools, relationships, resources, and threats continuously. Intelligence did not simplify life. It made life manageable at the expense of mental rest. Over time, this trade-off hardened into a defining feature. Human intelligence became expansive, recursive, and self-referential. It did not stop once danger passed, because danger was rarely singular. It came in waves, uncertainties, and possibilities. Intelligence learned to stay on. This constant readiness is often mistaken for superiority. In reality, it reflects how narrow the human margin for error has always been. Intelligence is what allowed humans to survive without physical dominance. It is also what keeps the human mind engaged long after survival is secured. This origin shapes everything that follows. Human intelligence exists not as a symbol of control, but as a response to persistent exposure. It is the last strategy that remained when the body offered none. Walking upright changed the human body in a way that no other single shift ever did. It did not simply alter posture, it rewrote priorities. When early humans began to rely on 2 legs instead of 4, they traded stability for reach. Standing upright freed the hands, allowing objects to be carried, shaped, and used repeatedly. This small mechanical change expanded what humans could do without changing what they were physically capable of defending against. The body became taller but not stronger, slower but more visible. Upright walking exposed vital organs, narrowed the base of balance, and made sudden directional movement harder. In exchange, it created a new kind of opportunity. Hands could now manipulate the world continuously, not just during moments of feeding or threat. This shift did not immediately favor intelligence. It demanded it. An upright body cannot rely on constant physical readiness. It must predict when movement is necessary. It must choose where to step, when to carry, what to hold, and what to leave behind. Bipedal movement is less forgiving. A fall causes more damage. An injury limits mobility more severely. Each step requires awareness. Over time, this requirement shaped cognition. Walking became not just locomotion, but navigation. The environment was no longer something the body pushed through instinctively. It became something the mind had to map. Upright posture also altered perspective. Seeing farther meant noticing threats earlier. but it also meant interpreting more information. The horizon widened. Visual input increased. Decisions had to be made sooner and with less certainty. This constant evaluation favored brains that could process complexity without immediate physical feedback. Intelligence grew alongside this need to interpret rather than react. The freed hands accelerated this process. Objects could be transformed into tools, but tools are useless without foresight. Carrying a tool means anticipating future use. Protecting a tool means valuing it beyond the present moment. Teaching another individual how to use it requires memory, imitation, and communication. Upright walking therefore linked movement to planning. The body no longer solved problems by brute force. It positioned the mind to do so instead, but this came with a biological price. Standing upright constrained the pelvis. The same structure that allowed efficient walking limited the space available for childbirth. As the brain expanded, this conflict intensified. Human infants had to be born earlier in development, with brains unfinished and bodies dependent. This vulnerability did not slow intelligence. It deepened it. A long period of dependence created more time for learning, but it also increased risk. Survival now depended not only on individual movement, but on coordinated care. Upright walking made humans visible and exposed. Intelligence had to compensate by organizing protection beyond the individual body. The act of walking upright, therefore, did not create intelligence directly. It created conditions where intelligence became necessary to offset new weaknesses. Balance had to be managed mentally. Risk had to be assessed in advance. Injury had to be avoided rather than endured. Over time, cognition absorbed these responsibilities. The human body moved through the world in a more fragile configuration, relying on awareness to keep it intact. Upright walking did not make humans superior movers. It made them thinkers out of necessity. Every step carried consequence. Every movement required calculation. Intelligence became embedded not just in survival decisions, but in the act of moving itself. This is why human intelligence is so deeply tied to anticipation and control. It grew inside a body that could not afford to fall often. As upright walking reshaped movement, it quietly reshaped birth. The pelvis that allowed efficient bipedal motion could not expand freely without compromising stability. This created a biological bottleneck. As human brains grew larger, the space available for childbirth did not grow at the same pace. Evolution did not solve this by widening the pelvis indefinitely, because doing so would have reduced walking efficiency and increased injury. Instead, it adjusted timing. Human infants began to be born earlier in development, before the brain reached maturity. This decision was not gentle. It produced newborns who could not walk, cling, or protect themselves. Compared to other mammals, human infants were unfinished. Their survival depended entirely on others. This vulnerability was not a temporary inconvenience. It became a defining feature of the species. A large brain could not be carried safely to full term, so it had to continue developing outside the womb. This meant that intelligence did not arrive fully formed. It unfolded slowly, shaped by environment, relationships, and learning. The cost was constant risk. An infant unable to move or feed independently requires protection for years. Any breakdown in care could be fatal. This pressure reshaped social behavior. Intelligence had to extend beyond individual problem solving into coordination, trust, and shared responsibility. A narrow pelvis did not just make birth difficult, it forced intelligence to become social by necessity. The body could no longer guarantee survival alone. As a result, the brain grew in a world of dependence. This prolonged dependency increased learning capacity, but also increased exposure to harm. Young humans were sensitive to stress, neglect, and environmental instability. Their brains absorbed not just information, but patterns of safety and threat. Intelligence, therefore, developed alongside heightened awareness of others. Facial expressions, tone, proximity, and intention mattered. The mind learned to read subtle cues because physical escape was impossible. This sensitivity became a strength in complex social environments, but it came from fragility, not confidence. The constraints of childbirth also placed selection pressure on mothers. Birth was dangerous. Injury or death during delivery was common. This reinforced the need for group support and shared knowledge. Techniques, timing, and assistance had to be learned and passed on. Intelligence became a repository for survival practices that the body alone could not encode. Each generation depended on the accumulated understanding of the previous one. The pelvis remained narrow, the brain continued to grow. The solution was not anatomical perfection, but cognitive adaptation. This trade-off explains why human intelligence is so deeply linked to learning and teaching. Knowledge became the substitute for biological readiness. The infant brain remained plastic, able to absorb information rapidly because it had to. There was no fallback instinct to rely on. The price of this plasticity was prolonged vulnerability. Intelligence grew inside a body that could not protect it during its most critical phase. That reality shaped cognition toward caution, attachment, and long-term planning. The mind learned that survival was not immediate or guaranteed. It depended on sustained effort and cooperation over time. This early exposure to dependency did not disappear with adulthood. It left traces in how humans form bonds, anticipate loss, and seek stability. Intelligence carried the memory of being unprotected. The constraints imposed by upright walking and narrow hips did not limit intelligence. They defined its character. Human intelligence is not just large, it is slow-growing, socially embedded, and shaped by early fragility. It developed not in isolation, but under constant care. This origin matters because it explains why human cognition is so sensitive to environment and so responsive to change. It was built to adapt continuously because the body could not finish the job before birth. Intelligence had to complete what anatomy could not. The human brain did not expand in an open biological landscape. It grew inside boundaries that never fully adjusted to accommodate it. The narrow pelvis remained. The fragile newborn body remained. The slow physical maturation remained. Intelligence had to develop within these limits, rather than overcoming them. This shaped not only how large the brain became, but how it functioned. Growth could not be rushed. Neural development stretched across years, then decades. This prolonged timeline allowed intelligence to become flexible and adaptive, but it also meant that cognition was never sealed off from vulnerability. At every stage, the brain depended on protection provided by others, by tools, by environments carefully managed to reduce risk. Intelligence, therefore, learned to operate cautiously. It favored anticipation over force, avoidance over confrontation, and preparation over reaction. These tendencies were not cultural inventions. They were biological necessities imposed by a body that could not withstand frequent failure. As the brain continued to grow after birth, it did so in constant interaction with the world. Experience shaped structure, stress altered development, safety allowed exploration. Intelligence became responsive rather than fixed. This responsiveness is often celebrated as a strength, but it carries instability. A brain that remains plastic for long periods is also a brain that remains impressionable. It absorbs patterns of threat and reassurance deeply. The same flexibility that allows learning also allows fear to persist. The body's limitations ensured that intelligence could never become detached from context. It had to monitor surroundings continuously because the cost of misjudgment remained high. Even as adults, humans retain a body that is easily injured and slow to repair. Intelligence never outgrew the need to manage that risk. This is why human cognition is so attentive to possibility rather than certainty. It operates in probabilities, scenarios, and contingencies. It does not wait for danger to appear. It imagines it. This habit traces back to a time when physical error was rarely survivable. The brain learned to prevent harm by simulating it internally. Over time, this internal simulation became constant. Intelligence did not switch off once the immediate biological constraints were managed. The pelvis did not widen. Infancy did not shorten. Vulnerability did not disappear. Instead, layers of external protection accumulated. Shelter, clothing, medicine, and social systems reduced physical risk. But they did not change the underlying design. The brain continued to function as if the margin for error were narrow, because historically it always was. Intelligence grew powerful, but it never became relaxed. Its structure reflects its origin. A mind built to protect a fragile body remains alert even when the body is temporarily safe. This explains why human intelligence often feels restless rather than triumphant. It was not shaped to celebrate survival. It was shaped to ensure it continued. The limits imposed by upright walking and constrained birth did not fade into the background of evolution. They remained active pressures that intelligence had to manage continuously. The brain expanded into a space that biology could not redesign easily. It learned to compensate indefinitely. Intelligence therefore carries a sense of unfinished business. It is always adjusting, always recalibrating, always preparing for imbalance. This is not a flaw. It is a reflection of the conditions under which it emerged. Human intelligence grew inside a body that could not fully support it, and that imbalance never resolved. The mind became the place where unresolved biological tension was managed. This origin explains why intelligence feels both expansive and burdensome at the same time. It is powerful because it had to be. It is heavy because it never stopped compensating. Human childhood is unusually long, and this length is not accidental. It is the direct consequence of a brain that cannot be completed before birth and a body that cannot survive on instinct alone. Most animals enter the world equipped with behaviors that activate almost immediately. They walk, cling, hunt, or hide within hours or days. Humans do none of these things. A human infant arrives without the ability to move independently, regulate its environment, or recognize danger reliably. This is not a flaw that needed correction. It is a condition that intelligence grew inside. Because instinct was insufficient, learning became mandatory. Survival no longer depended on what the body knew automatically, but on what the mind could absorb over time. Childhood stretched outward to create space for this process. The extended human childhood is not a period of rest. It is a prolonged exposure to uncertainty. A young human must observe before acting, imitate before understanding, and depend before choosing. This dependence creates vulnerability, but it also creates opportunity. A brain that is not locked into fixed responses can be shaped by experience. Intelligence begins here, not as problem solving, but as pattern recognition. The child learns which movements are safe, which sounds signal danger, which faces provide protection. This learning is slow because the cost of error is high. A wrong step, a misread signal, or a misplaced object can cause injury or death. Instinct would be faster, but it would also be rigid. In an environment that shifts across seasons and generations, rigidity becomes a liability. Childhood lengthened because adaptability mattered more than speed. The brain needed time to sample the world before committing to a response. This sampling process required a protected developmental window, which only social care could provide. As a result, intelligence became inseparable from caregiving. Knowledge was not discovered alone, it was transmitted. Adults became extensions of the child's incomplete survival system. They carried information that the child's body could not encode genetically. Fire use, tool handling, food preparation, and social boundaries all had to be learned. Each lesson replaced an instinct that never formed. Intelligence grew as a substitute for inherited certainty. This substitution came with a psychological cost. A child who must learn everything also learns uncertainty early. The world is not immediately legible. Signals must be interpreted. Intentions must be inferred. This fosters attention, memory, and caution. The brain remains open, absorbing not only skills but emotional patterns. Safety and threat are learned through repetition, not reflex. This makes intelligence sensitive to environment in a way instinct-driven species are not. A stable childhood produces confidence. An unstable one produces vigilance. Both outcomes shape cognition long after childhood ends. The long developmental period also allowed intelligence to become cumulative. Skills did not reset each generation. They accumulated. A child could learn not just from immediate surroundings, but from practices refined over centuries. This accumulation amplified intelligence beyond individual capacity. But it also meant that survival became increasingly dependent on shared knowledge. A child raised without access to that knowledge was at a severe disadvantage. Intelligence therefore became social by design. It required others to complete itself. This dependency never fully disappears. Even adult intelligence relies on structures learned early. Language, norms, and expectations formed during childhood continue to guide thought. The brain that grows slowly carries its early conditions forward. This is why human intelligence often feels layered and unfinished. It developed under the assumption that learning never truly ends, because it began in a state of prolonged incompleteness. Childhood did not merely precede intelligence. It shaped its form. A mind that must learn to survive remains attentive, flexible, and alert. These traits allowed humans to adapt widely, but they also ensured that certainty would always be provisional. Intelligence emerged not from early mastery, but from extended dependence. It learned to compensate for what instinct never provided, and that compensation required time. Learning did not become important to humans because curiosity emerged. It became essential because instinct could no longer guarantee survival. In species where instinct dominates, learning refines behavior at the edges. In humans, learning replaced the core. From early childhood onward, almost every survival-relevant action had to be acquired. How to find food, how to prepare it safely, how to avoid danger, how to interpret social signals, how to respond to conflict. None of these came pre-installed. This created a constant demand on the brain. The human mind had to remain receptive long after birth, because stopping learning meant falling behind. Learning therefore became continuous, not episodic. It did not end when basic competence was reached. Conditions changed too often. Tools improved. Social rules shifted. New threats appeared. A fixed behavioral set would quickly become obsolete. Intelligence adapted by staying open. This openness carried risk. A mind that is always learning is also always vulnerable to misinformation, fear, and error. But evolution favored adaptability over certainty. Humans who could revise behavior survived more often than those who acted automatically. Learning became the mechanism through which intelligence stayed relevant. This shift altered how the brain evaluated experience. Events were not simply endured, they were stored, compared, and integrated. Memory expanded not just to recall facts, but to guide future behavior. A mistake was not just painful, it was informative. Pain taught, loss instructed. Observation replaced trial and error wherever possible. Because physical trial carried too much risk, the brain learned to simulate outcomes internally. This simulation reduced immediate danger, but it increased mental activity. Intelligence began to operate ahead of the body, rehearsing possibilities before action. Learning thus reshaped time perception. The present was no longer the only reference point. Past experiences informed current choices, and imagined futures influenced restraint. This temporal extension is a defining feature of human intelligence. It allows planning, but it also creates delay, doubt, and hesitation. Learning-based survival favors caution. Acting too quickly without sufficient information can be fatal. As a result, intelligence became conservative by default. It checks, compares, and evaluates before committing. This pattern looks like thoughtfulness, but it originates from exposure to irreversible consequences. Learning also transformed social dynamics. Knowledge could not be rediscovered by each individual. It had to be shared. A person who learned alone wasted time and energy. Teaching accelerated survival. This made communication indispensable. Intelligence expanded to support instruction, imitation, and correction. Errors could be prevented if knowledge moved efficiently through a group. Over generations, this created a cumulative advantage. Each child started not from zero, but from the edge of what the group already knew. This accumulation amplified intelligence far beyond individual learning capacity. However, it also created dependency. A human without access to shared knowledge was not merely inexperienced. They were exposed. Learning as survival tied intelligence to culture. The brain adapted to absorb norms, tools, and practices that varied across groups. This flexibility allowed humans to inhabit diverse environments, but it also made intelligence context-sensitive. What worked in one place failed in another. Learning had to remain active throughout life. There was no final state of readiness. This perpetual incompleteness shaped cognition. Humans became alert to change, sensitive to deviation, and attentive to feedback. Intelligence did not stabilize because the conditions that demanded it did not stabilize. Learning remained the primary defense against uncertainty. This explains why human intelligence feels effortful. It is always updating. It carries the burden of adaptation that instinct once handled silently. The mind became the site where survival adjustments occurred in real time. Learning was not optional. Enrichment, it was the price of staying alive without reliable instinct. Intelligence formed around this demand. It became dynamic, responsive, and unfinished by design. Dependence did not disappear as learning expanded. It deepened because survival knowledge could not be encoded instinctively. It had to be carried by others. A human child did not just rely on adults for food and protection. It relied on them for access to accumulated understanding. This created a structure where intelligence was never isolated within a single mind. It flowed across generations. Each generation became a temporary vessel for knowledge that would outlast it. This changed how intelligence functioned. Thinking was no longer just about solving immediate problems. It became about preserving solutions long enough for others to inherit them. Memory extended beyond individual experience. Stories, routines, and repeated behaviors became storage systems for survival information. Intelligence learned to externalize itself. Tools carried technique. Language carried instruction. Ritual carried warning. This allowed human cognition to scale beyond biological limits. A single brain could only learn so much in one lifetime. Shared knowledge removed that ceiling. But this system required prolonged dependence. A child could not simply observe once and act. Many skills took years to master. During that time, mistakes could be fatal. Dependence, therefore, had to be stable and predictable. Social bonds became survival infrastructure. Trust, attachment, and obligation were not emotional luxuries. They were mechanisms that kept intelligence alive long enough to mature. The brain learned within a network of protection. This shaped cognition towards sensitivity Recognizing who could be trusted mattered as much as recognizing physical danger. Intelligence expanded to track social reliability, authority, and intention. The cost of misjudgment remained high. Being excluded or misaligned with the group could mean loss of knowledge access. Dependence created pressure to conform, imitate, and internalize shared norms. This pressure was not oppressive by design. It was protective. It ensured continuity. Over time, intelligence became conservative in how it adopted change. Novelty was weighed against inherited wisdom. Innovation occurred, but cautiously. This balance allowed progress without abandoning proven strategies too quickly. The mind learned to hold old knowledge and new possibilities simultaneously. This layered cognition is a defining human trait. It did not arise from creativity alone. It arose from the need to protect fragile learners while still adapting. Dependence also extended the emotional timeline of intelligence. Because learning was tied to care, experiences of safety and threat became emotionally charged. Knowledge was not neutral. It was embedded in relationships. A warning carried the voice of the person who taught it. A technique carried the memory of who demonstrated it. Intelligence absorbed not just information, but context. This made human cognition deeply associative. Memory linked facts with feelings, places, and people. This richness enhanced recall and application, but it also increased mental complexity. Intelligence became heavier. It carried layers of meaning beyond utility. This weight did not slow survival. It stabilized it. A child who remembered who taught a lesson remembered why it mattered. Over generations, this emotional embedding strengthened knowledge transmission. But it also ensured that intelligence would never be simple. It would always reflect the conditions under which it was learned. Dependence delayed autonomy, but it expanded capacity. By the time a human reached independence, their intelligence was already collective. It contained contributions from many minds. This allowed humans to solve problems no individual could solve alone. But it also meant that intelligence could never be fully self-sufficient. Even advanced cognition relies on inherited frameworks. Language, categories, and assumptions formed early and persist quietly. This is why human intelligence feels historical. It carries traces of past solutions even when current conditions change. Dependence ensured continuity, but it also anchored thinking to prior contexts. Intelligence grew powerful by accumulating knowledge slowly and carefully. It accepted incompleteness as a permanent state. A mind built through dependence does not seek final answers. It seeks workable ones that can be passed on. This orientation explains why human intelligence continues to expand without ever feeling finished. It was shaped to survive by learning from others, not by reaching closure alone. The human brain is an expensive organ. It consumes a disproportionate amount of energy compared to its size, demanding constant fuel even when the body is at rest. In early humans, this created a severe constraint. Energy is not abstract. It must be gathered, processed, and allocated. A brain that consumes too much without delivering survival value would be eliminated quickly. Yet the human brain grew larger and more demanding over time. This growth did not happen because energy was abundant. It happened because intelligence began to solve the problem of energy itself. Early humans faced an imbalance. Their bodies were not optimized for constant physical dominance, but their brains required steady caloric input. Hunting was unpredictable. Foraging varied by season. Starvation was common. Under these conditions, a large brain should have been a liability. It survived because cognition improved efficiency. Intelligence reduced wasted effort. It allowed planning of routes, timing of hunts, and selection of resources with higher returns. Instead of reacting to hunger, humans learned to anticipate it. This anticipation reduced energy loss and stabilized intake. The brain justified its cost by managing scarcity more effectively than instinct-driven behavior could. However, this balance was fragile. Raw food alone could not reliably support a brain of this size. Digesting uncooked food requires time and energy, and much of its caloric value is lost. Early humans were constrained by their digestive systems as much as by their environment. Teeth and jaws were not built to process large volumes of tough raw material indefinitely. Without a shift in energy processing, brain expansion would have stalled. Intelligence needed a new source of fuel, one that could be extracted more efficiently. This pressure set the stage for a pivotal change. The control of fire did not simply provide warmth or protection. It transformed energy availability. Cooking altered food at a chemical level, breaking down structures that the human body struggled to process on its own. Calories became more accessible. Nutrients required less effort to absorb. Time spent chewing and digesting decreased. Energy gained per unit of food increased. This change did not make humans stronger physically. It made them energetically stable enough to support a demanding brain. Intelligence did not emerge after cooking as a reward. It depended on cooking to survive. Fire externalized digestion. The environment began to do part of the body's work. This freed metabolic resources that could be redirected to the brain. Over time, natural selection favored individuals whose cognition could manage fire safely and consistently. Fire requires planning. It must be maintained, protected, and shared. Its benefits are delayed rather than immediate. A mind capable of foresight was necessary to extract its value. This created a feedback loop. Intelligence made fire useful. Fire made intelligence sustainable. As brain energy demands increased, reliance on controlled food processing deepened. The human digestive tract shortened. Teeth became smaller. Jaw muscles reduced. These changes reflect a trade-off. Energy moved away from digestion and toward cognition. The body reshaped itself around the brain's needs. This reallocation was irreversible. Once the brain became dependent on high-energy processed food, survival without it became difficult. Intelligence locked humans into a system that required constant management of resources. Hunger became not just a physical sensation, but a logistical problem. The mind had to think ahead to prevent it. This necessity shaped cognition toward planning, storage, and cooperation. Food preparation became social. Knowledge about fire and cooking had to be transmitted reliably. A mistake could waste scarce resources or cause harm. Intelligence absorbed these risks. It became responsible for energy flow. The brain grew not because energy was plentiful, but because it learned to control the conditions under which energy could be extracted efficiently. This origin matters. Human intelligence is not free. It is metabolically expensive and structurally dependent. It exists because early humans learned to restructure their environment to feed it. Without that restructuring, the brain could not have grown as it did. Intelligence survived by solving the problem of its own cost. Fire did not enter human life as a symbol or a discovery of curiosity. It entered as a solution to a biological limit. Before fire, food demanded long hours of chewing, digesting, and waiting. Much of its energy was lost before it could be used. The human body paid this cost directly. Time spent processing food reduced time available for vigilance, movement, and learning. As the brain grew more demanding, this inefficiency became dangerous. A large brain could not survive on marginal returns. Cooking changed this equation quietly, but completely. Heat broke down plant fibers, softened meat, and neutralized toxins. The same amount of food began to yield more usable energy with less effort. This was not convenience, it was metabolic relief. The body could redirect energy away from digestion toward other systems, most notably the brain. Fire allowed calories to arrive faster and in greater concentration. This shift did not simply support intelligence, it selected for it. Individuals who could manage fire effectively gained access to a richer energy stream. Those who could not were left behind. Fire demanded more than physical proximity. It required planning. Flames must be sustained, protected from wind and rain, and transported or recreated when lost. These tasks require memory, foresight, and coordination. A moment of inattention could extinguish hours of effort. A single mistake could destroy food or cause injury. Intelligence therefore became entangled with fire management. The brain learned to operate on delayed rewards. Effort invested now produced benefits later. This temporal gap strengthened planning ability. Fire also altered social structure. Cooking created gathering points. Food preparation became communal. Knowledge about timing, technique, and safety had to be shared. Intelligence expanded to support instruction and imitation around fire. These behaviors reinforced social bonds and stabilized energy distribution. Fire reduced individual risk by pooling resources, but it increased cognitive responsibility. Someone had to remember how to make it. Someone had to guard it. Someone had to decide how food was divided. Intelligence absorbed these tasks. The brain became a manager of energy flow, not just a consumer of it. Over generations, this dependency reshaped anatomy. Teeth reduced, jaw muscles weakened, the digestive tract shortened. These changes locked humans into reliance on processed food. Raw diets became less viable. Intelligence had to ensure continuity of cooking practices because biology no longer could. This dependency intensified the consequences of error. Losing fire meant losing access to adequate nutrition. Intelligence responded by embedding fire-related knowledge deeply into culture. Stories, rituals, and taboos preserved technique. This was not tradition for its own sake. It was survival insurance. The brain learned that forgetting could be fatal. Fire also extended the day. Light after sunset increased waking hours. More time meant more interaction, more teaching, and more planning. It also meant more mental activity. The brain did not rest when darkness fell. It continued to process information. This extension reinforced intelligence but increased cognitive load. The mind stayed engaged longer, managing risks and opportunities beyond daylight. Fire made the environment more predictable, but it made the mind more active. Intelligence thrived in this space, but it also became dependent on it. Without controlled energy processing, the brain could not sustain its own complexity. Fire externalized a biological function and handed it to cognition. The brain took responsibility for fueling itself. This responsibility did not disappear once food became plentiful. It became foundational. Intelligence learned to think about energy before hunger arrived. Planning meals, storing resources, and coordinating effort became permanent features of cognition. Fire was not a technological upgrade layered onto intelligence. It was a metabolic prerequisite that intelligence had to maintain. The human brain exists at its current scale because early humans learned to restructure energy flow outside their bodies. This restructuring bound intelligence to management, foresight, and social coordination. The cost of failure remained high. Intelligence continued to operate under pressure because the system it depended on required constant care. Fire made intelligence possible, but it also ensured that intelligence would never be passive. It had to stay engaged to keep itself fed. Once intelligence became dependent on controlled energy, it could no longer exist independently of the environment it shaped. Fire, cooking, and food preparation were not temporary aids. They became structural supports for the brain itself. This marked a turning point. The human mind was no longer adapting to a given environment, it was maintaining one. Survival shifted from reacting to nature towards sustaining systems that buffered the body from natural limits. This dependence changed the direction of intelligence. The brain no longer evolved simply to solve immediate problems. It evolved to keep complex processes running reliably over time. A lapse in attention could mean loss of fire, spoiled food, or wasted effort. Intelligence had to remain engaged even when danger was not present. This continuous responsibility altered mental rhythms. The mind stayed alert not because predators were near, but because the system it depended on could fail quietly. Energy management became an ongoing task rather than a response to hunger. Planning extended further into the future. Storage, timing, and coordination mattered more than momentary success. Intelligence absorbed this temporal expansion. It learned to operate across days, seasons, and generations. The environment became something to manage, not endure. This management reduced physical risk, but it introduced new forms of vulnerability. Systems require maintenance. They break down without oversight. The more intelligence reshaped the environment, the more fragile that environment became. A natural ecosystem recovers without instruction. A human-controlled one does not. Fire must be tended. Food must be prepared correctly. Knowledge must be preserved accurately. Mistakes now had cascading effects. Intelligence had to account for complexity it had created itself. This self-generated fragility is a defining feature of human cognition. The brain did not simply grow large. It became responsible for the conditions of its own survival. Even as societies stabilized, intelligence remained oriented toward prevention rather than response. The mind learned to imagine failures before they occurred, because system collapse could be sudden and unforgiving. This habit of anticipation persisted long after immediate scarcity diminished. Modern abundance did not erase the underlying design. The brain continues to function as if energy security must be actively defended. This explains why human intelligence is so concerned with logistics, optimization, and control. These traits are not cultural accidents. They are remnants of a time when losing access to cooked food meant cognitive decline and death. Intelligence locked itself into dependency. The body reduced its ability to survive without processed energy. The digestive system simplified. Physical resilience decreased. The brain assumed full responsibility for sustaining the external conditions it required. This closed a loop. Intelligence needed energy to exist. Energy required intelligence to be accessed. There was no return path. Once this loop formed, evolution favored minds that could manage increasingly complex environments. This management created further distance between the human body and raw nature. Intelligence became embedded in tools, routines, and social systems. It no longer resided solely inside the skull, but this externalization increased cognitive burden. The brain had to track not just physical threats, but procedural ones. Forgetting how to cook, store, or coordinate became as dangerous as encountering a predator. Intelligence therefore remained active, even in safety. This shift did not produce calm. It produced vigilance of a different kind. The mind became occupied with upkeep. This occupation shaped the subjective experience of intelligence. Thinking felt continuous because responsibility was continuous. The environment no longer reset each day. It accumulated dependencies. Intelligence had to keep pace. This is why human cognition feels tightly bound to context. It cannot fully disengage, because the systems it depends on cannot either. The brain evolved not just to think, but to maintain. This maintenance role explains why intelligence often feels heavy rather than triumphant. It carries the weight of systems that replaced biological simplicity. Fire and cooked food made the human brain possible, but they also ensured that intelligence would never be free from obligation. It had to remain active to keep itself alive. Humans did not survive as strong individuals. They survived as coordinated groups. From the beginning, a single human body was rarely sufficient to handle the demands of its environment. Hunting large prey, defending against predators, caring for vulnerable young, and maintaining fire and food systems all exceeded individual capacity. Survival depended on cooperation. This dependence reshaped intelligence fundamentally. Thinking was no longer only about navigating the physical world. It became about navigating other minds. Early humans had to predict not just animal behavior, but human behavior. Trust, timing, and alignment mattered as much as physical skill. A group could fail even when resources were available if coordination broke down. The brain learned to track relationships, remember interactions, and anticipate reactions. Social awareness became a survival skill. not a cultural refinement. In a group, danger does not always come from outside. Miscommunication, conflict, or abandonment can be just as fatal. Intelligence evolved to minimize these internal threats. Reading facial expressions, tone, posture, and intent allowed early humans to adjust behavior before conflict escalated. This sensitivity was not about harmony. It was about survival efficiency. Groups that maintained cohesion survived longer. Those that fractured wasted energy and lost protection. Intelligence favored individuals who could maintain balance within the group. This required restraint, empathy, and strategic behavior. These traits are often viewed as moral qualities, but they originated as practical tools. Understanding when to speak, when to remain silent, when to follow, and when to lead reduced risk. The brain became a regulator of social tension. This regulatory role increased cognitive load. The mind had to track multiple perspectives simultaneously. Actions had delayed social consequences. A decision that benefited one moment could harm future cooperation. Intelligence therefore extended into the realm of reputation. Being perceived as reliable mattered. Memory expanded to include social history. Who shared food? Who failed to help? Who could be trusted? This information influenced survival as directly as knowledge of terrain or prey. Intelligence integrated these variables into decision-making. Social survival also altered risk distribution. Individuals could take on specialized roles, but specialization increased dependence. A hunter relied on others for protection and care. A caregiver relied on others for food. This interdependence made intelligence collective. The success of one depended on the competence of others. As a result, intelligence evolved to support teaching and correction. Errors had to be identified early to protect the group. This required communication that went beyond simple signals. Language began to serve coordination rather than expression. Instructions, warnings, and agreements became essential. Intelligence learned to operate within shared frameworks. Rules emerged not as abstract ideals, but as tools to stabilize cooperation. Breaking a rule threatened group integrity. The brain learned to anticipate punishment and reward, shaping behavior preemptively. This anticipation created internal regulation. Intelligence began to manage impulses that could disrupt social balance. Physical dominance became less useful than social reliability. A strong individual who destabilized the group posed a risk. Intelligence favored those who could align their behavior with collective needs. This alignment did not eliminate conflict. It managed it. The mind learned to negotiate rather than confront directly. Over time, this shifted the primary arena of survival from the physical to the social. Many threats could be avoided through coordination alone. Intelligence thrived in this space, but it also became sensitive to social uncertainty. Exclusion, rejection, or loss of status carried real consequences. The brain treated these signals seriously because historically they mattered. Being separated from the group increased vulnerability dramatically. Intelligence learned to monitor belonging continuously. This monitoring persists even when physical survival no longer depends on it directly. Human intelligence remains attuned to social cues because it evolved inside collective systems where isolation meant danger. Group survival shaped cognition toward connection, prediction, and regulation. Intelligence did not grow solely to understand the world. It grew to manage relationships within it. This origin explains why human thinking is so deeply social. Even in solitude, the mind carries the imprint of group survival, constantly evaluating alignment, trust, and cohesion. Reading others became essential once survival depended on coordination rather than force. In a social species without strong physical defenses, misunderstanding another individual could be fatal. Early humans had to detect intention before action occurred. A delayed response to hostility, fear, or withdrawal could lead to injury, exclusion, or loss of protection. Intelligence adapted by becoming sensitive to subtle signals. Facial tension, gaze direction, posture, and changes in tone carried information that mattered. The brain learned to treat these cues as data. This sensitivity did not arise from empathy as a moral instinct. It arose from necessity. Knowing what another person was about to do allowed preemptive adjustment. Cooperation could be preserved. Conflict could be avoided. Intelligence shifted toward prediction of internal states rather than observation of external movement alone. This marked a major expansion of cognition. The mind now had to model other minds. It had to infer beliefs, desires, and fears that were not directly visible. This ability reduced physical confrontation. A warning glance could replace a fight. A subtle withdrawal could prevent escalation. Groups that mastered this form of communication conserved energy and reduced injury. Intelligence favored those who could interpret ambiguity correctly. Errors carried cost. Misreading intention could fracture trust. Over time, the brain became highly attuned to uncertainty in social contexts. It learned to gather multiple signals before acting. This created layered evaluation. Human intelligence rarely relies on a single cue. It aggregates. This aggregation increases accuracy but slows response. The mind hesitates, checks, and reassesses. This pattern reflects the danger of social miscalculation. Acting too quickly on incomplete information could damage relationships that survival depended on. Intelligence therefore learned restraint. Emotional awareness became part of survival logic. Understanding fear, anger, or distress in others allowed intervention before breakdown occurred. This awareness did not remove threat. It redistributed it. The primary danger shifted from immediate physical harm to long-term social instability. Intelligence adapted accordingly. Memory expanded to track patterns of behavior over time. A single interaction was less informative than a sequence. Trust became probabilistic. The brain learned to update its assessments continuously. This constant evaluation increased cognitive load. Social environments are complex and variable. Signals can be deceptive. Intentions can change. Intelligence had to remain flexible and alert. This alertness became chronic. Even in moments of safety, the mind monitored social dynamics. Exclusion remained a risk. Intelligence treated social signals with seriousness because historically they predicted survival outcomes. This vigilance persists in modern contexts, even when physical danger is absent. The brain still reacts to social rejection as if it threatens survival. This is not an error. It is a legacy. Reading others also shaped communication itself. Language evolved to clarify intention where nonverbal cues were insufficient. Words allowed explicit coordination. But words also introduced ambiguity. Meaning could be manipulated. Intelligence adapted by learning to interpret context, tone, and consistency. The mind became a detector of alignment. It looked for coherence between what was said and what was done. Intelligence had to hold competing interpretations simultaneously. It learned to delay judgment. This delay reduced immediate error, but increased mental activity. Social intelligence therefore expanded cognition inward. The brain spent more time evaluating internal representations of others rather than external threats. This shift did not simplify survival. It made it socially safer but cognitively heavier. Intelligence carried the burden of social prediction continuously. The ability to read others allowed humans to coordinate at scale. It enabled complex group behavior, but it also ensured that human intelligence would never be purely individual. Thinking became relational. Decisions were filtered through anticipated reactions. The mind learned to simulate social consequences before acting. This simulation protected group stability but kept intelligence active even when no action was required. Human cognition remains deeply shaped by this need to read others. It explains why thoughts often revolve around interpretation, misunderstanding, and reassurance. Intelligence evolved to navigate fragile social systems where survival depended on alignment rather than dominance. That origin still shapes how the human mind operates today. Dependence within a group did not stabilize intelligence. It kept it under constant pressure. Once survival relied on others, the consequences of individual action expanded. A mistake no longer affected only the person who made it. It could weaken the entire group. This amplified the cost of error. Intelligence adapted by internalizing restraint. Impulses that might be harmless in isolation became dangerous in a collective setting. Acting without considering others risked conflict, exclusion, or breakdown of cooperation. The brain learned to simulate group-level outcomes before committing to behavior. This simulation became automatic. Thoughts began to include imagined reactions, consequences, and reputational effects. Intelligence became anticipatory rather than reactive. It learned to ask not just what will happen, but how others will respond. This added a new layer of cognitive work. The mind now had to coordinate internal goals with external expectations. This coordination never fully resolved. Group needs change, alliances shift, roles evolve. Intelligence remained adaptable because fixed strategies failed in dynamic social systems. Maintaining cohesion required continuous adjustment. The brain learned to monitor tension and resolve it early. Small disagreements were addressed before they escalated. This vigilance reduced catastrophic conflict but increased mental activity. Intelligence became responsible for balance. It mediated between personal survival and collective stability. This mediation shaped cognition toward compromise, negotiation, and delayed gratification. Short-term gain often threatened long-term cooperation. Intelligence learned to sacrifice immediacy for continuity. This trade-off did not remove desire, it regulated it. Over time, internal regulation became a defining feature of human thought. The mind learned to hold competing motivations simultaneously. This complexity allowed large groups to function, but it also made thinking heavier. Dependence also shaped how intelligence handled uncertainty. In a group, information is rarely complete. Decisions must be made with partial knowledge of others' intentions. Intelligence adapted by tolerating ambiguity. It learned to operate without certainty. This tolerance reduced paralysis, but it required constant updating. New information could shift alliances or priorities. The brain stayed flexible, revising models of others continuously. This revision consumed attention. Intelligence became iterative rather than final. It rarely reached closure because social systems rarely settle. Group survival further expanded intelligence across time. Norms and expectations persisted beyond individual lifespans. A person inherited obligations they did not choose. Intelligence learned to navigate traditions that predated it. This inheritance stabilized behavior but constrained freedom. Deviating from established patterns carried risk. The mind learned to evaluate when change was safe and when it threatened cohesion. This evaluation demanded historical awareness. Memory extended beyond personal experience into shared pasts. Intelligence absorbed stories, rules, and lessons shaped by prior failures. These inherited frameworks reduced trial and error, but increased cognitive load. The brain carried solutions to problems it had never personally faced. This made intelligence efficient, but it also made it conservative. Group survival favored continuity over constant innovation. Change had to be justified. Intelligence learned to weigh novelty against stability. This balancing act persists today. The human mind often hesitates between preserving what works and exploring what might work better. This hesitation is not indecision. It is the residue of group-based survival. Dependence also shaped emotional experience. Approval and rejection became signals with real consequences. Pain from exclusion discouraged behavior that threatened cohesion. Satisfaction from acceptance reinforced alignment. These responses were not exaggerated. They were calibrated to survival stakes. Over time, emotional sensitivity became integrated into cognition. Intelligence did not separate thought from feeling. Feelings became data. They informed decisions about trust, belonging, and risk. This integration increased adaptability but reduced detachment. Human intelligence rarely operates coldly because it evolved within relational systems where emotional cues mattered. The mind carries the imprint of collective dependence. It remains attuned to alignment, conflict, and stability even when survival no longer depends directly on them. Intelligence grew powerful by functioning inside groups, but it paid for that power with constant internal regulation. The need to maintain cohesion never disappeared. It became embedded in how humans think. Language did not appear to decorate thought. It appeared because instinct could no longer carry survival information reliably enough. In earlier species, critical behaviors were embedded directly into the body. When to flee, when to hunt, when to mate. These responses activated automatically. requiring little interpretation. Humans lost much of this certainty. Their environments changed too quickly. Their tools evolved too fast, and their social structures became too complex for instinct alone to keep pace. Knowledge that mattered for survival could not wait for genetic transmission. Language emerged as the mechanism that replaced inherited certainty with shared instruction. Through language, humans could transmit information that the body did not know how to encode. Where food was located, which plants were dangerous, how to prepare meat safely. When seasonal changes altered risk, none of this could be solved through reflex. Language allowed one mind's experience to become another mind's warning without requiring repetition of harm. This was a profound shift. Survival knowledge no longer depended on direct exposure. It could be inherited socially. Intelligence expanded to support this exchange. The brain learned to structure information in sequences, to associate sounds with meaning, and to retain abstract rules that had no immediate physical referent. Language extended intelligence beyond the present moment. A spoken warning could describe a danger not currently visible. A story could preserve a mistake long after those involved were gone. This ability reduced physical risk dramatically, but it increased cognitive responsibility. Someone had to remember. Someone had to interpret correctly. Language introduced ambiguity where instinct had been clear. Words could be misunderstood. Intentions could be misread. Intelligence adapted by becoming sensitive to context. Meaning was no longer fixed. It depended on tone, timing, and shared understanding. This required additional mental work. The brain learned to infer not just what was said, but what was meant. Language also altered group dynamics. Instructions could coordinate action at a distance. Plans could be discussed before execution. Roles could be assigned without physical demonstration. This allowed groups to function with greater efficiency and scale. But it also created dependence on communication accuracy. Intelligence evolved to monitor coherence. Consistency between words and actions became important. Trust became tied to speech reliability. The mind learned to evaluate speakers as much as statements. This evaluation added another layer to cognition. Language transformed learning from observation-based to instruction-based. A child no longer had to watch every action repeatedly. They could be told. This accelerated skill acquisition but increased vulnerability to error. Incorrect teaching could propagate quickly. Intelligence responded by reinforcing repetition, confirmation, and correction. Language became regulated through social feedback. Words were tested against outcomes. Over time, this produced shared vocabularies anchored in collective experience. Language was not neutral. This selective process bound language tightly to practical concerns. Even abstract terms often trace back to physical needs, relationships, or risk management. Language also allowed intelligence to become recursive. Humans could talk about talking. They could refine rules, debate strategies, and adjust norms consciously. This reflexivity expanded cognitive depth, but it also increased mental load. Meaning existed not only in the world, but in shared symbols. Language became an external memory system that intelligence had to maintain. Forgetting how to speak, interpret, or teach correctly carried cost. Survival increasingly depended on communicative competence. Language did not simplify intelligence. It amplified it by moving essential knowledge outside the body. The brain adapted to operate within this symbolic environment. Thinking became verbal, structured, and transmissible. Intelligence accepted this trade-off because the alternative was relying on instinct that no longer fit the human condition. Language became the tool that allowed intelligence to persist across generations in a body that could not encode what it needed to survive. Language did more than carry information forward in time. It replaced a function that genes could no longer perform efficiently. Genetic transmission is slow. It preserves behaviors that remain useful across thousands of generations. Human environments did not allow that luxury. Tools changed within lifetimes. Social rules shifted as groups grew. New dangers appeared faster than biology could respond. Language stepped into this gap. It became a storage system for experience that could update immediately. What one person learned through loss, others could avoid through words. This shift transformed intelligence into something cumulative rather than repetitive. Survival no longer required each generation to rediscover the same limits. Language allowed knowledge to stack. Each layer rested on the previous one. This stacking accelerated adaptation beyond what natural selection alone could achieve. Intelligence expanded outward into shared memory. The mind no longer carried survival information alone. It accessed it through others. This reduced individual burden but increased collective dependence. Forgetting was no longer just personal. It threatened group continuity. Language therefore developed mechanisms to preserve accuracy. Repetition, storytelling, and ritual emerged not as culture for its own sake, but as safeguards. Important information had to survive distortion. Intelligence learned to encode lessons in forms that were harder to forget. Narrative made warnings memorable. Rhythm and structure aided recall. Emotional weight reinforced retention. These techniques were not artistic accidents. They were cognitive strategies shaped by survival pressure. Language also changed how intelligence related to time. Genetic memory looks backward without awareness. Language allows deliberate reference to the past. This extended intelligence beyond personal lifespan. A single mind became a temporary node in a much longer chain. Thinking incorporated perspectives that were not present. This broadened planning horizons. Decisions were informed by remembered failures and successes across generations. Intelligence became historical. It did not start fresh, but this inheritance also introduced constraint. Past solutions could persist even when conditions changed. Language preserved habits as well as insights. Intelligence had to learn when to trust inherited knowledge and when to revise it. This created tension between tradition and adaptation. The mind learned to negotiate continuity rather than discard it. Language also externalized error. Mistakes could be named, analyzed, and corrected without repeating them physically. This reduced risk but increased abstraction. Intelligence began to operate at a distance from immediate consequence. The mind simulated outcomes using words instead of actions. This made thinking safer, but it also made it more complex. Layers of interpretation accumulated. Meaning depended on shared understanding. Misalignment could propagate quickly. Intelligence responded by developing norms of clarification and correction. Questions, explanations, and repetition became tools to stabilize shared memory. Language required maintenance. Without active use, meanings drifted. This maintenance demand kept intelligence engaged. Knowledge had to be refreshed continually. Teaching became a survival role. Those who could communicate clearly increased group resilience. Those who could not introduced risk. Intelligence began to value coherence and consistency. Speech was evaluated not just for content, but for reliability over time. This evaluation shaped trust. Language also allowed intelligence to detach from the immediate body. Instructions could guide actions performed later or elsewhere. This separation increased reach, but reduced feedback. Errors might not be discovered until consequences appeared. Intelligence learned to anticipate downstream effects. Planning extended further ahead. Language became a tool for managing uncertainty across time and space. This role explains why human intelligence is so concerned with explanation. To explain is to reduce future error. Language transformed intelligence into a system that could store, revise, and transmit survival knowledge rapidly. It replaced genes as the primary archive for living in a changing world. But this replacement came with cost. The brain had to manage symbols continuously. Intelligence did not become simpler. It became distributed, historical, and dependent on shared understanding. Language kept intelligence alive beyond the limits of biology. But it also ensured that thinking would never rest. Shared memory requires constant care. As language took over the role of preserving survival knowledge, intelligence became dependent on something fragile. Words are not stable objects. They change meaning, lose precision, and shift with context. Unlike instincts, which activate automatically, language must be interpreted. This interpretation introduces uncertainty. A message can be misunderstood. A warning can be ignored. A rule can be followed too rigidly or not enough. Intelligence had to absorb this instability. The mind learned to operate in a symbolic environment where meaning was negotiated rather than fixed. This negotiation required constant attention. Thinking became heavier because it could no longer rely on certainty. Every statement carried the possibility of error. Language expanded intelligence, but it also multiplied points of failure. Survival information now passed through memory, interpretation, and trust. It began to evaluate not only what was said, but how, by whom, and under what conditions. Intelligence developed skepticism alongside comprehension. Doubt became protective. This doubt did not eliminate misunderstanding, but it reduced blind acceptance. The cost was mental effort. The mind stayed active, checking consistency, comparing versions, and revising beliefs. Language also created distance between experience and action. A person could know a danger existed without ever encountering it. This reduced physical risk, but it weakened sensory grounding. Intelligence had to rely on representations rather than direct feedback. This abstraction required imagination to fill gaps. The brain learned to simulate experiences internally. These simulations could protect, but they could also mislead. Over time, intelligence became populated with scenarios that never occurred. Possibility expanded faster than reality. This expansion increased vigilance. The mind prepared for outcomes that might never arrive. Language made this possible. It allowed fears, hopes, and plans to exist without immediate evidence. This capacity improved survival flexibility, but it also burdened cognition. The brain carried more than what was happening. It carried what could happen. Language also tied intelligence to social validation. Meaning is shared. A word only works if others recognize it. This made thinking dependent on collective agreement. An idea that could not be expressed clearly could not be acted upon safely. Intelligence learned to shape thought into communicable form. This shaping filtered cognition. Some experiences were simplified to fit language, others were exaggerated. Precision mattered, but it was difficult to maintain. Miscommunication became a constant risk. Intelligence adapted by developing norms, definitions, and repetition. These tools stabilized meaning, but they required maintenance. The mind remained engaged even when no action was required. Language also preserved outdated knowledge. Because it carries history, it can retain solutions that no longer fit current conditions. Intelligence had to learn to identify when inherited words described realities that had changed. This required meta-awareness. The mind began to think about thinking. It questioned its own assumptions. This reflexivity deepened intelligence, but increased complexity. Thought no longer flowed directly from perception. It passed through layers of inherited language. Each layer added potential distortion. Intelligence learned to correct itself, but correction required effort. Language did not allow rest. Silence reduced risk of error, but it also reduced coordination. Intelligence balanced expression and restraint continuously. The brain became a manager of symbols rather than a direct responder to the world. This management role explains why human thinking often feels dense and persistent. Intelligence must keep language aligned with reality to remain useful. When alignment slips, consequences follow. Words can misguide action as easily as they can protect it. The mind therefore stays alert. Language enabled intelligence to survive across generations, but it demanded constant oversight. Intelligence accepted this burden because the alternative was losing accumulated knowledge entirely. Language did not free the mind, it extended it, while tying it to a system that requires endless care. This dependency shaped human cognition into something expansive, historical, and restless. Thinking became inseparable from maintaining meaning. The brain learned to live inside words, even when that life became heavy. Human intelligence did not remain anchored in the present. Once language and learning allowed knowledge to accumulate, the mind began to operate across time. Memory expanded beyond immediate recall. It became a tool for survival, remembering where danger occurred, when food was available, and how others behaved in the past, reduced the need for repeated exposure. Intelligence learned to consult what had already happened before deciding what to do next. This consultation moved thinking backward in time. The present moment was no longer sufficient. Past experience became a reference point that shaped restraint, anticipation, and avoidance. This shift protected the body from repeated harm, but it altered mental balance. The mind carried yesterday into today. Memory did not fade once it had served its purpose. It lingered, available for reuse. This persistence was adaptive. A danger that occurred once could occur again. Forgetting too quickly carried risk. Intelligence, therefore, favored retention over release. The brain learned to store not just outcomes, but emotional markers attached to them. Fear, relief, and loss became tags that highlighted what mattered. These tags increased recall speed, but they also ensured that past events retained influence long after their relevance had passed. Intelligence accepted this cost because the alternative was exposure. Memory then connected with imagination. To use past information effectively, the mind had to project it forward. Intelligence began to simulate possible futures using fragments of prior experience. If something happened before, it might happen again. If a pattern emerged, it could repeat. This projection allowed avoidance without direct testing. The body stayed safer. The mind grew busier. Imagination became the space where risks were evaluated without physical action. This ability marked a decisive departure from instinct. Instinct responds to what is. Imagination prepares for what might be. This extension reduced injury but increased mental activity. The mind learned to live slightly ahead of reality. It rehearsed scenarios, compared options, and delayed decisions. These processes were efficient for survival, but they rarely stopped. A brain built to anticipate threat cannot easily disengage when threat is absent. Memory and imagination reinforced each other. Past pain informed future caution. Imagined futures intensified emotional responses to remembered events. Intelligence became layered across time. The body moved in the present, but the mind occupied multiple moments at once. This layering allowed complex planning and coordination. It also introduced vulnerability. When memory exaggerates relevance or imagination overextends possibility, the mind becomes occupied by outcomes that never occur. Intelligence did not evolve to guarantee accuracy. It evolved to reduce fatal error. Overestimating danger was safer than underestimating it. This bias shaped cognition toward vigilance. Memory preserved warnings. Imagination multiplied them. Together, they created a mental environment richer than the physical one. Intelligence operated within this internal space continuously. The benefits were clear. Humans could plan migrations, coordinate hunts, and avoid known hazards. But the cost was ongoing, mental engagement. The mind rarely returned fully to the present. It evaluated, compared, and predicted even during rest. This pattern did not weaken intelligence. It defined it. Human cognition became temporal rather than immediate. It treated time as a resource to be managed mentally. Memory and imagination allowed survival beyond the limits of instinct. But they also ensured that intelligence would carry weight beyond the present moment. The mind learned to protect a fragile body by leaving the now. This departure became habitual. Intelligence did not choose it. It inherited it as a survival strategy. Imagination extended intelligence beyond memory. Remembering the past reduced repeated harm, but imagining the future reduced harm that had never occurred yet. This ability allowed humans to prepare without exposure. A threat did not need to be present to influence behavior. The mind could construct it internally. This was a powerful survival tool. It allowed planning routes before travel, preparing shelter before storms, and avoiding danger before it emerged. Intelligence gained distance from immediate reality. The body could remain still while the mind explored possible outcomes. This separation reduced physical risk but increased cognitive activity. Imagination filled the space between what was known and what was uncertain. It allowed intelligence to operate under incomplete information. When evidence was limited, the mind generated scenarios. Some were accurate, many were not. Evolution favored this imbalance. Preparing for a danger that never arrives costs energy. Failing to prepare for one that does arrive costs life. Intelligence therefore leaned toward overproduction of possibility. The mind learned to ask what could go wrong rather than what will. This orientation protected survival, but it also ensured that thinking rarely stopped at what was happening now. A past event could be replayed in altered forms, extended into multiple futures. A single loss could produce many imagined repetitions. Intelligence used these projections to guide restraint and caution. The body avoided risk. The mind absorbed the burden. Over time, imagination became habitual. It did not activate only in response to clear threat. It ran in the background, scanning for patterns and extrapolating outcomes. This constant simulation allowed humans to coordinate complex actions, but it also made rest difficult. The brain continued working even when no decision was required. Imagination also altered emotional regulation. Feelings no longer required direct stimulus. Fear could arise without danger. Relief could appear without resolution. Anticipation itself became emotionally charged. Intelligence learned to respond to internal representations as if they were external events. This responsiveness improved preparedness, but it blurred boundaries between reality and possibility. The mind treated imagined outcomes with seriousness because historically that seriousness prevented harm. Imagination also enabled abstraction. Humans could consider outcomes far removed from immediate experience. This supported long-term planning, cultural development, and large-scale cooperation, but abstraction increased mental distance from the body. Physical signals became less dominant. Hunger, fatigue, and safety cues competed with imagined priorities. Intelligence sometimes overrode the body in service of future-oriented goals. This override improved survival at group level, but increased individual strain. The mind pushed forward even when the body signaled rest. Imagination allowed sacrifice in the present for benefits later. This trade-off built civilizations, but it also entrenched cognitive tension. The future was never fully reached. There was always another scenario to prepare for. Intelligence adapted by refining imagination, but it could not eliminate excess. Filtering possibility became as important as generating it. The brain developed constraints through experience and social feedback, but these constraints were imperfect. Imagination remained expansive because contraction carried risk. Underestimating possibility was more dangerous than overestimating it. This bias explains why human intelligence often feels restless. The mind continues to simulate even in safety. Imagination does not shut down once survival is secured. It remains active because it evolved under conditions where security was temporary. Intelligence learned to treat uncertainty as default. The future was never guaranteed. Imagining it became necessary. This necessity shaped cognition into something that rarely settles fully into the present. The mind left the now to protect the body. That departure became permanent. Imagination allowed humans to survive beyond instinct, but it ensured that intelligence would always live slightly ahead of reality, carrying possibilities that may never occur, yet cannot be ignored. Memory and imagination did not remain separate functions. Over time, they fused into a single cognitive loop. The mind began to move continuously between what had happened and what might happen, rarely resting in what was happening now. This loop became the core operating mode of human intelligence. Memory supplied material, imagination reshaped it. Together, they generated internal landscapes that guided behavior more powerfully than immediate sensation. This fusion reduced reliance on direct experience. The body no longer needed to encounter danger to respond to it. The mind could rehearse responses in advance. This rehearsal improved survival efficiency, but it also shifted the center of gravity inward. Intelligence became less anchored to the present moment. Attention divided. One part of the mind tracked the environment. Another evaluated remembered patterns. Another projected outcomes. This division allowed complex planning, but it fragmented awareness. The present became only one input among many. Memory-imagination loops reinforced caution. A remembered failure could be replayed and extended into multiple imagined futures. Each replay strengthened avoidance. This mechanism prevented repeated harm, but it also preserved outdated relevance. A danger that no longer existed could continue to influence behavior. Intelligence did not prioritize emotional accuracy. It prioritized safety. Letting go of a warning too early was riskier than holding it too long. The mind therefore erred on the side of persistence. This persistence explains why certain memories remain vivid even when they no longer serve survival. Imagination kept them active by finding new contexts in which they might apply. Intelligence became conservative in releasing information. It held on to possibilities because the cost of forgetting was historically high. Over time, this created a mental environment denser than the physical one. The mind carried layers of past and future simultaneously. Decisions were informed by scenarios rather than sensations. This density increased cognitive load. Intelligence spent energy evaluating internal representations instead of responding directly to the world. The benefit was flexibility. The cost was restlessness. The brain learned to stay active because inactivity reduced preparedness. Even in moments of safety, the loop continued. Memory supplied caution. Imagination supplied contingency. Together, they produced a constant low-level vigilance. This vigilance was not fear in the modern sense. It was readiness, shaped by uncertainty. The present moment became something to be monitored rather than inhabited fully. Intelligence adapted to this mode because it worked. Groups that anticipated change survived environmental shifts. Individuals who prepared avoided injury. The loop persisted because it reduced fatal error, but it also altered subjective experience. Humans began to live mentally elsewhere. Satisfaction was delayed. Relief was temporary. The mind moved on quickly to the next possibility. This movement did not reflect dissatisfaction. It reflected design. Intelligence was not built to settle. It was built to scan. Memory and imagination combined to keep the mind slightly ahead of events. This kept the body safe, but it made mental stillness rare. The loop also shaped identity. Humans began to define themselves through remembered pasts and imagined futures. The present self became a transition point rather than a destination. Intelligence oriented toward continuity across time. This orientation allowed long-term projects, shared goals, and collective planning. It also ensured that cognition remained active even without immediate threat. The mind could not fully disengage because the future always mattered. Memory and imagination, therefore, did not add optional features to intelligence. They restructured it. Thinking became temporal by default. The present lost exclusivity. This design explains why human intelligence feels expansive yet heavy. It carries time within it. The mind learned to leave the present to protect a vulnerable body. That departure became habitual. Intelligence did not forget how to return. It simply learned that staying too long carried risk. Awareness of death did not arrive as a philosophical insight. It emerged as a consequence of intelligence operating across time. Once the human mind learned to remember the past and imagine the future, it inevitably encountered an endpoint. Other species respond to threat and injury in the present. Humans learn to project themselves forward, and in doing so, they discovered absence. The ability to anticipate outcomes made survival more effective, but it also revealed a certainty that could not be avoided. Every imagined future eventually ended. Intelligence did not invent death. It made death visible before it occurred. This visibility altered cognition fundamentally. Survival was no longer only about avoiding immediate danger. It became about managing the knowledge that danger could not be escaped forever. The mind had to hold this information without collapsing into paralysis. This required adaptation. Awareness of death became integrated into decision-making quietly rather than dramatically. It shaped priorities, restraint, and long-term planning. Knowing that time was limited increased the value of coordination, learning, and continuity. Intelligence began to operate under an unspoken deadline. Actions mattered not only because of their immediate effects, but because they occurred within a finite span. This awareness intensified memory and imagination. Past experiences gained weight because they could not be repeated indefinitely. Future plans gained urgency because opportunities were not endless. The mind learned to measure choices against irreversibility. This measurement improved survival efficiency. Risks were weighed more carefully. Resources were conserved. Knowledge was preserved for others. Awareness of death pushed intelligence outward, toward legacy rather than momentary success. The mind carried a background understanding that no amount of preparation could remove final uncertainty. Intelligence learned to function alongside this knowledge rather than resolving it. It did not seek constant attention. It remained present as a quiet constraint. Decisions were filtered through it implicitly. This filtering shaped human behavior toward meaning-making. If life was finite, actions needed justification beyond survival alone. Intelligence began to organize experience into narratives that extended beyond individual lifespan. Contribution replaced dominance. Teaching replaced hoarding. Continuity became more valuable than immediate gain. Awareness of death reinforced social bonds because survival extended through others. The mind learned that being part of a group increased persistence beyond the body. This realization did not eliminate fear. It redirected it. Death became less an immediate threat and more a structural fact. Intelligence adapted by embedding this fact into culture, ritual, and routine. These practices stabilized cognition. They provided frameworks for holding awareness without constant distress. Awareness of death also increased sensitivity to loss. When intelligence understands that time is limited, separation carries finality. The mind treats loss seriously because it cannot assume reversal. This seriousness strengthened attachment. Relationships gained depth because they were not replaceable indefinitely. Intelligence learned to invest emotionally despite vulnerability. This investment improved cooperation and care, but it also intensified grief. Awareness of death did not weaken intelligence, it sharpened it. The mind learned to plan within limits, to value continuity, and to preserve knowledge against disappearance. But it also learned to carry an unresolved truth. Intelligence could not solve mortality. It could only respond to it. This response shaped cognition toward reflection, caution, and long-term orientation. Awareness of death did not sit at the center of attention. It operated at the edges, influencing choices without dominating them. Human intelligence learned to function with an ending in view. This capacity allowed survival beyond instinct. But it also ensured that thinking would always carry weight beyond the present moment. Knowing that life ends changed how intelligence valued time, action, and connection. It built itself around it. Knowing that life ends altered how intelligence related to everything that came before it. Once the mind accepted that time was finite, attachment gained weight. Relationships were no longer interchangeable. Moments were no longer repeatable without limit. Intelligence began to treat connection as something that could not always be replaced or deferred. This changed behavior quietly, but permanently. Humans invested more carefully. They planned beyond immediate survival toward continuity of care, knowledge, and presence. The future became a space not only to avoid danger, but to preserve what mattered. Awareness of death sharpened planning because it imposed constraint. Choices now excluded alternatives forever. Intelligence learned to weigh opportunity cost in human terms. To choose one path meant abandoning others permanently. This realization encouraged foresight and restraint. Impulsive action risked wasting limited time. Intelligence adapted by slowing decision-making where consequences were irreversible. This slowing improved long-term outcomes, but it also increased deliberation. The mind spent more time evaluating what mattered most. This evaluation did not produce clarity easily. Meaning became a problem intelligence had to address. Survival alone was no longer sufficient explanation for effort. If life ended, why invest beyond immediate need? Intelligence responded by anchoring purpose and continuation through others. Teaching, caregiving, and contribution allowed actions to persist beyond individual lifespan. This orientation strengthened social structures. Knowledge was passed forward intentionally. Skills were preserved deliberately. Awareness of death transformed intelligence from a tool for personal survival into a mechanism for collective persistence. But this transformation introduced emotional cost. Attachment intensified vulnerability. Loss became more painful because it could not always be compensated. Intelligence understood that absence might be permanent. Grief became deeper because imagination could no longer fill the gap with expectation of return. The mind carried both connection and the certainty of its end. This dual awareness shaped emotional regulation. Intelligence learned to tolerate sorrow without shutting down attachment entirely. Avoiding connection would reduce pain, but it would also weaken survival systems built on cooperation. Intelligence therefore accepted risk. It invested despite knowing loss was inevitable. This acceptance was not resignation, it was adaptation. Knowing that time was limited encouraged prioritization. Effort shifted toward what could endure. Rituals, traditions, and shared narratives emerged to stabilize this process. They gave structure to memory and meaning. Intelligence used them to hold awareness of death without allowing it to dominate daily function. These frameworks allowed individuals to act purposefully even when outcomes were uncertain. Awareness of death also changed how intelligence perceived success. Immediate dominance mattered less than lasting impact. Actions were evaluated by how they affected others over time. This evaluation reinforced cooperation and discouraged wasteful conflict. Intelligence learned to align short-term behavior with long-term consequence. This alignment required constant recalibration. Circumstances changed. Values shifted. Intelligence remained flexible, but oriented toward continuity. Knowing that life ended also heightened sensitivity to time passing. Delays felt costly. Opportunities felt finite. Intelligence became attentive to timing, when to act, when to wait, when to let go. This attentiveness improved coordination, but it increased mental engagement. The mind tracked not only what was happening, but when it was happening relative to an unseen endpoint. Awareness of death did not produce despair by default. It produced focus. But this focus came with weight. Intelligence carried the responsibility of choosing under constraint. It could not rely on infinite revision. Decisions mattered because they could not be undone indefinitely. This pressure shaped human cognition toward reflection and care. The mind learned to consider consequences beyond immediate survival. It began to organize life around meaning rather than mere continuation. Awareness of death thus transformed intelligence into something that planned not just to live, but to matter. It accepted finitude as a condition rather than a problem to solve. This acceptance allowed humans to build systems that outlasted them, even as it ensured that thinking would always carry the quiet presence of an ending. Intelligence never solved the problem of knowing how life ends. It learned how to live alongside that knowledge. The human mind did not eliminate uncertainty. It expanded around it. It could retreat into denial, or it could continue thinking despite the weight. Survival favored the latter. The mind learned to carry knowledge that had no solution. This capacity became one of the most distinctive features of human intelligence. Thinking did not stop because an answer was missing. It adapted to operate without closure. This adaptation shaped cognition into something open-ended. Questions replaced conclusions. Meaning became provisional rather than fixed. Intelligence learned to function without final certainty. This was not weakness. It was flexibility. A mind that demands resolution would stall when faced with unsolvable truths. Human intelligence learned to remain active anyway. It continued planning, teaching, caring, and building under the shadow of an ending it could not change. This persistence allowed continuity. Knowledge moved forward even when individuals did not. Awareness of death pushed intelligence outward. It encouraged contribution rather than accumulation. Ideas mattered more than possession. Understanding mattered more than control. The mind learned to value processes that could continue beyond any single life. This orientation did not erase fear. It contextualized it. Fear became one signal among many, not the final authority. Intelligence balanced caution with engagement. It did not withdraw from the world despite knowing its limits. It stayed involved. This involvement created complexity. Human intelligence became layered with reflection, memory, imagination, and awareness of finitude. It carried all of these simultaneously. Thinking became heavier, but also deeper. The mind learned to hold contradiction. Life was precious because it was temporary. Planning mattered because outcomes were finite. Attachment hurt because separation could be permanent. Intelligence did not resolve these tensions. It integrated them. This integration allowed humans to act meaningfully without certainty. The mind learned to ask not only how to survive, but how to use limited time. This question had no single answer. It built cultures, languages, and systems that offered provisional responses rather than final ones. The absence of closure became a feature, not a failure. Human intelligence thrives in open questions. It continues to think because stopping would remove the ability to adapt. Knowing that life ends did not halt progress. It shaped it. Intelligence became a process rather than a destination. It did not aim to complete understanding. It aimed to sustain it. This orientation explains why human thinking never feels finished. There is always another consideration, another perspective, another possibility. The mind remains active because the conditions that shaped it demanded continuity rather than resolution. Awareness of death did not give intelligence an endpoint. It gave it direction. It pointed thinking toward what could be preserved, shared, and passed on. The human mind learned to operate with an ending in view, without letting that ending define every moment. This balance is fragile. It requires constant adjustment. Intelligence never rests completely because its task never fully ends. It exists to manage uncertainty, not eliminate it. The question that remains is not whether intelligence is superior, but whether superiority was the goal at all. It succeeded, but it did so by creating a mind capable of knowing more than it could resolve. This knowledge expanded possibility and burden simultaneously. The mind learned to carry both. It continues to do so. Intelligence remains open, unfinished, and responsive. It lives with questions rather than answers. And perhaps that is the final consequence of knowing too much. Human intelligence did not reach its limits when it learned how to survive. It reached them when it learned how much could never be fully resolved. From weakness came adaptation. From adaptation came memory. From memory came imagination. And from imagination came awareness of an ending that no amount of thinking could remove. Intelligence did not grow to bring comfort. It grew to keep fragile bodies alive in unstable conditions. Along the way, it inherited questions that had no biological solution. What matters when time is limited? How much preparation is enough? When thinking protects, and when it begins to weigh too heavily. The human mind learned to live with these tensions rather than eliminate them. That ability allowed continuity. Knowledge moved forward even when individuals did not. Meaning was constructed even when certainty was unavailable. Intelligence proved superior not because it conquered nature completely, but because it adapted to limits without stopping. It carried memory without becoming trapped in it. It used imagination without fully escaping reality. It planned for futures it would never see. This made human cognition expansive, but also restless. Thinking rarely settles because the conditions that shaped it never allowed rest. Survival required anticipation. Connection required vulnerability. Awareness required acceptance of loss. Intelligence learned to balance all three imperfectly. It continues to do so. Even now, the mind does not seek a final answer to why it exists. It continues to ask how to act within what it cannot change. Perhaps intelligence was never meant to bring closure. Perhaps it was meant to keep life moving forward under constraint. The human mind remains open because closing it would remove the ability to adapt. Knowing more than can be resolved is not a flaw of intelligence. It is the cost of it. And so the question remains, quietly, without demand for an answer. Did intelligence make humans superior, or did it simply allow them to survive long enough to know what survival cannot explain?